Thank you. So, over to you, folks. We've got a good time for this session. Yes, yes.
Thanks to both of you for your papers. I have a question for Ruben. Of course, it was, I would agree that your description of John Mayer's use of the criteria approach leads into a dead end. So that is not really a use of the criteria approach that does make any sense. But in my view, one has to take into account that this was not the criteria approach as it was used when it was developed in the 50s and 60s of the 20th century. When Ernst Käsemann formulated this very famous statement of double dissimilarity, he immediately in the next sentence, that is mostly neglected, said that this criterion of double dissimilarity, of course, only leads to a minimal core of Jesus tradition and has to be elaborated further on the basis of such a core. So he didn't want to say that such a criterion had to be used in a strict sense of figuring out authentic and inauthentic tradition. But it's only, let's say, heuristic way of figuring out some basic tradition. And Ferdinand Hahn, in a very important article on methodologische Überlegungen zur Rückfrage nach Jesus, so as methodological considerations on a quest of a historical Jesus, argued that the criteria should not be used for isolating authentic from, or to make or distinguishing between authentic and inauthentic traditions, but that they should be embedded into a wider historiographical approach to the quest of the historical Jesus. And Hahn made a very important remark, namely that these criteria are not all on the same level. So one has to distinguish, for example, between criteria on a more general level, like for example coherence, and more specific criteria, for example Aramaic language, or traces of Aramaic language. So these criteria are not all of these criteria are on the same level. And then Hahn described the historiographical work with regard to Jesus as a circle. You always have to presuppose a portrait of Jesus, and then you can apply these criteria, so to speak, some idea of what's going on with this person in his time, in this region, and so on. And then you have to have some criteria to decide between different traditions that we have about this person. So what I want to say is, these criteria, of course, should not be isolated from more general historiographical work. And I would say we cannot distract from these rules, whether you call them criteria or not, it's not very important. But we cannot completely leave aside rules for our historical work. Otherwise, every cats are grey. So, and we have to make some, or we have to give up the historical question at all. So when we would have to say, of course, there are many traditions about Jesus, and everything is a memory of Jesus, and there is no distinction. So we have no criteria or rules or whatever to make a distinction between these different traditions. So Jesus was remembered in that way in the 1st century, and in another way in the 4th century, and in another way in the 7th century, and in the 19th century, and so on. And all these traditions are, or all these portraits are on the same level. But if we do not want to give up the historical quest, then we have to have some rules for our historical work, to make distinctions between traditions that we want to use for a historical portrait of Jesus and other traditions that we do not want to use, or what we regard as later embellishments or legends or fictions or inventions or whatever. And I would say that is the case for the parables as well. Not all of the parables are on the same level with regard to a historical quest.
Yes, it's not really a question, but following up our discussion yesterday, I'm not really sure how to answer, because as far as I understand, you want to keep up the criteria approach in general. Maybe it's just rules to work historically. And I, at least in the compendium of the parables as well as in the miracle story, did not differentiate between different levels. For me, it was enough to say the tradition assumed Jesus told this parable. You can consider that it's not historical work anymore, but it's at least methodologically better to be controlled, because I look at the text itself. And on the other hand, I agree with you that apart from the inner textual strategies, we have extra-textual rules or criteria. For example, I use them on the level of the macro text. That, as you have realized, Matthew for me is younger than Mark, for example. On that level, it is in a criteria. But how far would you go, and what is historical work? If we be more humble to our decisions, I think that might be still historical work, but with refraining from having different layers. So that's what I at least can't control.
I would say that the difference is whether you want to describe the Jesus tradition just on a textual level, or whether you would regard it as important also to ask for a historical portrait of Jesus. I would never say, and I always argued, that this historical portrait is not a reality behind the texts. But nevertheless, I would say it is still an important question to ask what historical portrait can be established on the basis of the traditions, even if it is always our portrait. And it's my impression that with your approach, you would just give up that question.
I would not fully give it up, but if I may, just another short question. But I would keep the level of the text. These are portraits which are still historical portraits. They present Jesus as a historical figure, but in John at on the same level as in Mark, for example. So I don't give it up, but I look closer at the level of the text, this portrait, and not a mixed portrait behind the text.
It's not behind the text. It's never behind the text.
Okay, let's move on. Over here, please.
Hi, I've got a question for James. I was wondering if you think we can learn anything about the reception of Jesus in rabbinical literature from the description of holy men, or particularly Galilean holy men. Do you think that traditions about Jesus have anything to do with the traditions about like Hanina Mendoza or people like that? Are they perhaps rabbinic reactions to Jesus, or are they adaptations of Jesus' traditions, or are they something entirely separate?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that they are. I'm not convinced that there's a direct reaction or engagement with Jesus' traditions in the kind of things that Vimesh made famous. I think their usefulness is in possibly establishing the kinds of ideas about holy men prayer and exorcism and so on that I'm qualifying this as I go along, may have been present in Galilee, Palestine around the time of Jesus, and they could have been the kinds of ideas that were framing how Jesus was understood, let's say in the 20s, 30s, or whatever. So they're kind of useful as a possible historical reconstruction of first century Galilee, with all the usual caveats that this is very difficult to reconstruct on the basis of something which really has been edited. Things have been edited from 200 CE onwards. The idea, the similarities between the two are interesting, the language of son and father and so on. So I think there's something useful that can be said, but with all due qualification. I don't think they're as such reacting against Jesus, though. I don't think there's anything strongly indicating that.
Not Goodacre. Gentleman in the rather nice maroon shirt.
Thank you for both stimulating papers. I'd like to thank Ruben especially for being the first person to mention Q in 2 days of conference activity. And I'd like to follow that up with a question about Matthew. You had a lovely phrase, Ruben. It was something like that in the parables, Jesus drinks deeply from the well of the everyday. And I can see that, for the sower and the mustard seed and even the tenants in the vineyard. But I don't think I can see it in the parable of the talents, where, you have these huge amounts of money being given out, or in the parable where we have, 10,000 talents, which is like saying zillions of dollars. And that raises a big question, doesn't it, about parable research in general, which is that Matthew's parables do, as Michael Gold once said, move amongst the millionaires. And there's that interesting question when we are looking at historical Jesus material, can that Jesus be the same Jesus that does drink deeply from the well of everyday life that you have in Mark and quite often in Luke's parables?
Yes, thanks a lot. And we won't start to discuss about Q. That's, but indeed, this background in daily life differs from the sources, and it's even in Q, for example, or if you say Matthew and Luke can overlap, we see it's not only Galilean life of agrarian life, but we find already a lot about oikos, for example, this whole idea of households and master. That's an important master slaves. So the background is much wider and richer than we normally think about it. And I think the talents is only one example. What about the parable of the leaven? It's an amount of dough which is normally not used to make family bread. So these backgrounds I look at with social historical work and using all material we can gather to really illuminate what is the field from which this parable is taken. But it's still not only fixed to a certain social environment, it's always a transfer of meaning. And these transfer signals are in the text themselves.
James, you want to
Come back. I'm not making a judgment on this, but they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, I don't think. They may be. But you could say in a peasant context cross-culturally, entertain the idea of things from everyday life and so on. Also exaggerations of wealth and so on. I don't see how that's necessarily a problem in itself. The other aspect of this is the gospel traditions have Jesus, of course, associating with the mission to the very wealthy as well. So there is that audience. I mean, we're often thinking, oh, Jesus is a nice guy, hangs around with the poor people. Well, quite a lot of he's hanging around with rich people. I think I would extend that to sinners as well. So that language would be quite appropriate in that context as well, potentially.
David Parish.
I'm not a biblical scholar, I'm a businessman who dabbles in biblical research, but I did contribute an article to the IVP Dictionary of Pastoral Theology and Ethics, looking at wealth and particularly banking in the first century. And I'm inclined to think the talents was not much of an exaggeration. Though this very wealthy elite was very small, I think Jesus crossed a whole demographic in his perambulations around Jerusalem. And I can well believe that he was aware of this wealthy elite. And whether he was setting them up or using it as pure metaphor is hard to say. But my question would be about the parable, say, of the Good Samaritan. There was obviously a corpus of tradition of Jesus or stories of Jesus. Was it not possible that each of the gospel writers selected those stories which suited their case, and Luke, having a good Samaritan, a good Gentile story, would use it, whereas Matthew probably wouldn't? I mean, is that a possibility, that we do have these differences?
Yes, thanks again for also dealing with the talents. Maybe I can add that it's not only experience, but also including what I call the stock metaphors. There is something in Jewish tradition, for example, which is well known, even if it's not daily life experience for someone. And that's, I think, we should be aware of these aspects as well. And regarding to your second question, and give me just one signal word.
Good Samaritan.
The Good Samaritan, sorry. Yes, the Good Samaritan as one part of a pool of parables. Yes, that could have been, but how could you prove that? So what we have is the sources, and it's only part of the Sondergut, and there's no one single mentioning of the Samaritan parable in the other sources. So I think nobody can answer this question.
Do you want to comment, James?
I'm going to try and answer the question. I think, I mean, I wouldn't push this too hard, but the parable of the Good Samaritan, and Richard, I think, will agree with me, I know he'll agree roughly with me on this, is infused with language of purity and impurity and so on and so forth, and directions moving from the temple is actually quite significant about where this can happen. And I think you can make a good case that that's the kind of themes and issues, and I'm not saying the parable necessarily goes back to Jesus, that could be a part of, say, early tradition or something like this, or earlier receptions of Jesus, because it's not that much in line with the interests of Luke. However, why does it get retained? Well, I think a lot of things to do with purity get retained in the gospel tradition because there's a strong ethical content, and this is important for differentiating between Jew, Gentile, Christian, the world, or whatever. So I think you could possibly make a case for at least the themes surrounding the Good Samaritan being a pre-Lucan tradition, or whatever language you want to use.
Okay, thanks. Chris Tilly.
Thanks, guys, for your papers. A lot of fun. Ruben, a question for you. I'm trying to think about your argument in light of Meyer's categories that he outlines in the first volume of his work on the historical Jesus, and he has the real Jesus, which we can't access. So I think there'll be agreement with everyone, even in all of the memory approaches on this. There's the historical Jesus. It's not the same thing as the real Jesus, but the Jesus that we access or that we can justify by means of the application of this criteria. And then there's the theological Jesus, which isn't an imaginary Jesus necessarily, can be related to the real Jesus, can be related to the historical Jesus. So the question then is, in light of the categorizations that he himself drives, how is your remembered Jesus of the parables different from his theological Jesus?
Yes, thanks. That's an important question because it draws back to the very beginning of historical Jesus research. That means historical Jesus is not a theological Jesus. And why do you know that? Because I think even if we take some kind of self-interpretation of Jesus himself could be theological. Using, for example, the bridegroom metaphor, that could have been used by Jesus himself, although it's strongly linked to the Jewish traditions. This isolation is one of the birth problems of historical Jesus research. And I think that's one of the major really efforts of Jens and others to say what we are looking for is always interpretive and theological frame. And at the end, I would add not only the theological Jesus, but the narrated Jesus. I think this term is maybe could used more often because what we find in the sources is narration, and Jesus is a narrated character. And what does that mean? Is it historical? Is it theological? It's on the text level, so at least if we look back, for example, to Luisen and Hayden White and so, it's of course historical, because all history is story. But it's of course narration, because if you start to narrate, it's a part of theology, interpretation, and so on. So the narrated Jesus may bridge these extremes, which I think really do not fit to the phenomenon.
Actually, it was already asked.
Okay, that's fine. Let's go to Rafa. Providing you're not going to ask Ruben to heal you.
I wouldn't ask for the microphone for that. I want to comment to Chris's question and extend what Ruben said, because Meyer's categorizations actually obscure what he's doing, because it sounds reasonable, and we would all agree that the historical Jesus is the real Jesus, the figure who was, is no longer accessible to us. But then it's not the case that the historical Jesus, in the sense of the Jesus that historical research can reconstruct, is simply something more benign, and so there it is, and we can argue about it. It is also an implicit claim that that Jesus represents the Jesus that we can't access in a way that should be normative, at least for historians, if not for theologians. And I think what the narrated Jesus concept is doing, and I like that language, is saying that that the problem isn't just with the reconstructions, but with the methods that are being used to make that reconstruction, not because it produces a faulty image of Jesus, but because it claims to produce something that, with one hand, Meyer seems to be taking away, oh, I'm not doing that, but then with the other hand saying, this is exactly what I'm doing. Is that fair? It's not a question.
Yeah, maybe. Yes. So I thought he's really consequent along his own lines, but I would never be satisfied with this result. So what is he looking for? And that's I think that's a major question also for us as the memory approach. For example, to take up Jens' discussion, what are you looking for in historical frames? Or are we looking for narrated, theological, and so on, some kind of historical figure? That's really, we should be aware of that.
Yes, yeah.
So,
Get the microphone first.
So to discuss Meyer's approach, in my view, it is not necessary to introduce a memory approach as you did. You can simply just criticize him for his using of historical method, because it is very reduced and very restricted. And as I said, this use of a criteria approach is not really meaningful. So this was not the intention of using criteria within historical work. So he isolates these criteria and then applies them to isolated Jesus traditions. And he looks at every Jesus tradition by its own and applies these criteria to them without making any difference between these criteria. And I think this methodological problem, or his methodological mistake, what he makes. So I wouldn't see a strict alternative between Meyer's approach and the memory approach, but I would say you have to criticize Meyer in the first place for his idea of historical work.